Dearest Father, you asked me recently why I maintain that I am afraid of you. As usual, I was unable to think of any answer to your question, partly for the very reason that I am afraid of you, and partly because an explanation of the grounds for this fear would mean going into far more details than I could even approximately keep in mind while talking. And if I now try to give you an answer in writing, it will still be very incomplete, because, even in writing, this fear and its consequences hamper me in relation to you, and because the magnitude of the subject goes far beyond the scope of my memory and power of reasoning. To you the matter always seemed very simple, at least in so far as you talked about it in front of me, and indiscriminately in front of many other people. It looked to you more or less as follows. You have worked hard all your life, have sacrificed everything for your children, above all for me, consequently I have lived high and handsome, have been completely at liberty to learn whatever I wanted, and have had no cause for material worries, which means worries of any kind at all. You have not expected any gratitude for this, knowing what children's gratitude is like, but have expected at least some sort of obligingness, some sign of sympathy. Instead, I have always hidden from you, in my room, among my books, with crazy friends, or with crackpot ideas. I have never talked to you frankly, I have never come to you when you were in the synagogue, never visited you at Franzensbad, nor indeed ever shown any family feeling. I have never taken any interest in the business or your other concerns, I saddled you with the factory and walked off. I encouraged Atla in her obstinacy, and never lifted a finger for you, while I do everything for my friends. If you sum up your judgment of me, the result you get is that, although you don't charge me with anything downright improper or wicked, you do charge me with coldness, estrangements and ingratitude. And, what is more, you charge me with it in such a way as to make it seem my fault, as though I might have been able, with something like a touch on the steering wheel, to make everything quite different, while you aren't in the slightest to blame, unless it be for having been too good to me. This, your usual way of representing it, I regard as accurate only in so far as I too believe you are entirely blameless in the matter of our estrangement. But I am equally entirely blameless. If I could get you to acknowledge this, then what would be possible is not, I think, a new life. We are both much too old for that, but still, a kind of peace. No cessation, but still, a diminution of your unceasing reproaches. Oddly enough, you have some sort of notion of what I mean. For instance, a short time ago you said to me, I have always been fond of you, even though outwardly I didn't act toward you as other fathers generally do, and this precisely because I can't pretend as other people can. Now, Father, on the whole I have never doubted your goodness toward me, but this remark I consider wrong. You can't pretend, that is true, but merely for that reason to maintain that other fathers pretend is either mere opinionated nests, and as such beyond discussion. Or on the other hand, and this in my view is what it really is, a veiled expression of the fact that something is wrong in our relationship and that you have played your part in causing it to be so, but without its being your fault. If you really mean that, then we are in agreement. I'm not going to say, of course, that I have become what I am only as a result of your influence. That would be very much exaggerated. It is indeed quite possible that even if I had grown up entirely free from your influence, I still could not have become a person after your own heart. I should probably have still become a weakly, timid, hesitant, restless person, neither Robert Kafka nor Karl Hermann, but yet quite different from what I really am. And we might have got on with each other excellently. I should have been happy to have you as a friend, as a boss, an uncle, a grandfather, even as a father-in-law. Only as a father you have been too strong for me, particularly since my brothers died when they were small and my sisters came along only much later. so that I alone had to bear the brunt of it, and for that I was much too weak. Compare the two of us, I, to put it in a very much abbreviated form, Aloe with a certain Kafka component, which, however, is not set in motion by the Kafka will to life, business, and conquest, but by a lowish spur that impels more secretly, more diffidently, and in another direction, and which often fails to work entirely. You, on the other hand, a true Kafka in strength, health, appetite, loudness of voice, eloquence, self-satisfaction, worldly dominance, endurance, presence of mind, knowledge of human nature. A certain way of doing things on a grand scale. Of course, also with all the defects and weaknesses that go with these advantages, and into which your temperament and sometimes your hot temper drive you. You are perhaps not wholly a Kafka in your general outlook, in so far as I can compare you with Uncle Philip, Ludwig, and Heinrich. That is odd, and here I don't see quite clear either. After all, they were all more cheerful, fresher, more informal, more easygoing, less severe than you. In this, by the way, I have inherited a great deal from you and taken much too good care of my inheritance, without, admittedly, having the necessary counterweights in my own nature. As you have. Yet you too, on the other hand, have in this respect gone through various phases. You were perhaps more cheerful before you were disappointed by your children, especially by me, and were depressed at home. Perhaps you have become more cheerful again since then, now that your grandchildren and your son-in-law again give you something of that warmth which your children, except perhaps Valley, could not give you. In any case, we were so different, and in our difference so dangerous to each other, that if anyone had tried to calculate in advance how I, the slowly developing child, and you, the full-grown man, would behave toward one another, he could have assumed that you would simply trample me underfoot so that nothing was left of me. Well, that did not happen. Nothing alive can be calculated. But perhaps something worse happened. And in saying this, I would all the time beg of you not to forget that I never, and not even for a single moment, believe any guilt to be on your side. The effect you had on me was the effect you could not help having. But you should stop considering it some particular malice on my part that I succumbed to that effect. I was a timid child. For all that, I am sure I was also obstinate, as children are. I am sure that mother spoiled me too, but I cannot believe I was particularly difficult to manage. I cannot believe that a kindly word, a quiet taking by the hand, a friendly look, could not have got me to do anything that was wanted of me. Now you are, after all, basically a charitable and kind-hearted person. But not every child has the endurance and fearlessness to go on searching until it comes to the kindliness that lies beneath the surface. You can treat a child only in the way you yourself are constituted, with vigor, noise, and hot temper. And in this case such behavior seemed to you to be also most appropriate, because you wanted to bring me up to be a strong, brave boy. Your educational methods in the very early years I can't, of course, directly describe today. But I can more or less imagine them by drawing conclusions from the later years and from your treatment of Felix. What must be considered as heightening the effect is that you were then younger and hence more energetic, wilder, more primitive, and still more reckless than you are today, and that you were, besides, completely tied to the business, scarcely able to be with me even once a day, and therefore made all the more profound impression on me, one that never really leveled out to the flatness of habit. There is only one episode in the early years of which I have a direct memory. You may remember it, too. One night I kept on whimpering for water, not, I am certain, because I was thirsty, but probably partly to be annoying, partly to amuse myself. After several vigorous threats had failed to have any effect, you took me out of bed, carried me out onto the Pavlach asterisk and left me there alone for a while in my nightshirt, outside the shut door. I am not going to say that this was wrong. Perhaps there was really no other way of getting peace and quiet that night, but I mention it as typical of your methods of bringing up a child and their effect on me. I dare say I was quite obedient afterward at that period, but it did me inner harm. What was for me a matter of course, that senseless asking for water, and then the extraordinary terror of being carried outside were two things that I, my nature being what it was, could never properly connect with each other. Even years afterward I suffered from the tormenting fancy that the huge man, my father, the ultimate authority, would come almost for no reason at all and take me out of bed in the night and carry me out onto the Pavlach, and that consequently I meant absolutely nothing as far as he was concerned. Pavlach is the Czech word for the long balcony in the inner courtyard of old houses in Prague. That was only a small beginning, but this feeling of being nothing that often dominates me, a feeling that is in another respect, admittedly, also a noble and fruitful one, comes largely from your influence. What I would have needed was a little encouragement, a little friendliness, a little keeping open of my road, instead of which you blocked it for me. Though of course with the good intention of making me take another road. But I was not fit for that. You encouraged me, for instance, when I saluted and marched smartly, but I was no future soldier, or you encouraged me when I was able to eat heartily or even drink beer with my meals, or when I was able to repeat songs, singing what I had not understood, or prattle to you using your own favorite expressions, imitating you, but nothing of this had anything to do with my future. And it is characteristic that even today you really only encourage me in anything when you yourself are involved in it, when what is at stake is your own sense of self-importance, which I damage or which is damaged in me. Then I receive encouragement, I am reminded of my worth, the matches I would be entitled to make are pointed out to me, and Peppa is condemned utterly. But apart from the fact that at my age I am already nearly unsusceptible to encouragement, what help could it be to me anyway, if it only comes when it isn't primarily a matter of myself at all? At that time, and at that time in every way, I would have needed encouragement. I was, after all, weighed down by your mere physical presence. I remember, for instance, how we often undressed in the same bathing hut. There was I, skinny, weakly, slight, you strong, tall, broad. Even inside the hut I felt a miserable specimen, and what's more, not only in your eyes but in the eyes of the whole world, for you were for me the measure of all things. But then when we stepped out of the bathing hut before the people, you holding me by my hand, a little skeleton, unsteady, barefoot on the boards, frightened of the water, incapable of copying your swimming strokes, which you, with the best of intentions, but actually to my profound humiliation, kept on demonstrating. Then I was frantic with desperation, and at such moments all my bad experiences in all areas fitted magnificently together. I felt best when you sometimes undressed first and I was able to stay behind in the hut alone and put off the disgrace of showing myself in public until at last you came to see what I was doing and drove me out of the hut. I was grateful to you for not seeming to notice my anguish, and besides, I was proud of my father's body. By the way, this difference between us remains much the same to this very day. In keeping, furthermore, was your intellectual domination. You had worked your way so far up by your own energies alone, and as a result you had unbounded confidence in your opinion. That was not yet so dazzling for me, a child as later for the boy growing up. From your armchair you ruled the world. Your opinion was correct, every other was mad, wild, meshuggah, not normal. Your self-confidence indeed was so great that you had no need to be consistent at all and yet never ceased to be in the right. It did sometimes happen that you had no opinions whatsoever about a matter, and as a result every conceivable opinion with respect to the matter was necessarily wrong, without exception. You were capable, for instance, of running down the Czechs, and then the Germans, and then the Jews, and what is more, not only selectively but in every respect. And finally nobody was left except yourself. For me you took on the enigmatic quality that all tyrants have, whose rights are based on their person and not on reason. At least so it seemed to me. Now, when I was the subject you were actually astonishingly often right, which in conversation was not surprising, for there was hardly ever any conversation between us, but also in reality. Yet this was nothing particularly incomprehensible, either. In all my thinking I was, after all, under the heavy pressure of your personality, even in that part of it and particularly in that which was not in accord with yours. All these thoughts, seemingly independent of you, were from the beginning burdened with your belittling judgments. It was almost impossible to endure this and still work out a thought with any measure of completeness and permanence. I am not here speaking of any sublime thoughts, but of every little childhood enterprise. It was only necessary to be happy about something or other, to be filled with the thought of it, to come home and speak of it, and the answer was an ironic sigh, a shaking of the head, a tapping on the table with a finger. Is that all you're so worked up about, or such worries I'd like to have, or the thing some people have time to think about, or where is that going to get you, or what a song and dance? About nothing. Of course, you couldn't be expected to be enthusiastic about every childish triviality when you were in a state of vexation and worry. But that was not the point. Rather, by virtue of your antagonistic nature, you could not help but always and inevitably cause the child such disappointments. And further, this antagonism, accumulating material, was constantly intensified. Eventually the pattern expressed itself even if, for once, you were of the same opinion as I. Finally, these disappointments of the child were not the ordinary disappointments of life but, since they involved you, the all-important personage, they struck to the very core. Courage, resolution, confidence, delight in this and that, could not last when you were against it, or even if your opposition was merely to be assumed. And it was to be assumed in almost everything I did. This applied to people as well as to thoughts. It was enough that I should take a little interest in a person, which in any case did not happen often, as a result of my nature for you. Without any consideration for my feelings or respect for my judgment, to move in with abuse, defamation, and denigration. Innocent, childlike people, such as, for instance, the Yiddish actor Lowy, had to pay for that. Without knowing him you compared him, in some dreadful way that I have now forgotten, to vermin and, as was so often the case with people I was fond of. You were automatically ready with the proverb of the dog and its fleas. Here I particularly recall the actor because at that time I made a note of your pronouncements about him, with the comment, "This is how my father speaks of my friend, simply because he is my friend." I shall always be able to bring this up against him whenever he reproaches me with the lack of a child's affection and gratitude. What was always incomprehensible to me was your total lack of feeling for the suffering and shame you could inflict on me with your words and judgments. It was as though you had no notion of your power. I too, I am sure, often hurt you with what I said, but then I always knew, and it pained me, but I could not control myself, could not keep the words back. I was sorry even while I was saying them. But you struck out with your words without much ado. You weren't sorry for anyone, either during or afterward. one was utterly defenseless against you. But your whole method of upbringing was like that. You have, I think, a gift for bringing up children. You could, I am sure, have been of help to a human being of your own kind with your methods. Such a person would have seen the reasonableness of what you told him, would not have troubled about anything else, and would quietly have done things the way he was told. But for me as a child, everything you called out to me was positively a heavenly commandment. I never forgot it. It remained for me the most important means of forming a judgment of the world. Above all, of forming a judgment of you yourself, and there you failed entirely. Since as a child I was with you chiefly during meals, your teaching was to a large extent the teaching of proper behavior at table. What was brought to the table had to be eaten, the quality of the food was not to be discussed, but you yourself often found the food inedible, called it, this swill. Said, that cow had ruined it. Because in accordance with your strong appetite and your particular predilection you ate everything fast, hot, and in big mouthfuls, the child had to hurry. There was a somber silence at table, interrupted by admonitions. Eat first, talk afterward, or, faster, 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 or, there you are, you see, I finished ages ago. Bones mustn't be cracked with the teeth, but you could. Vinegar must not be sipped noisily, but you could. The main thing was that the bread should be cut straight. But it didn't matter that you did it with a knife dripping with gravy. Care had to be taken that no scraps fell on the floor. In the end, it was under your chair that there were the most scraps. At table one wasn't allowed to do anything but eat, but you cleaned and cut your fingernails, sharpened pencils, cleaned your ears with a toothpick. Please, Father, understand me correctly. In themselves these would have been utterly insignificant details, they only became depressing for me because you, so tremendously the authoritative man, did not keep the commandments you imposed on me. Hence the world was for me divided into three parts, one in which I, the slave, lived under laws that had been invented only for me and which I could, I did not know why, never completely comply with. Then a second world, which was infinitely remote from mine, in which you lived, concerned with government, with the issuing of orders and with the annoyance about their not being obeyed. And finally a third world where everybody else lived happily and free from orders and from having to obey. I was continually in disgrace. Either I obeyed your orders, and that was a disgrace, for they applied, after all, only to me. Or I was defiant, and that was a disgrace too, for how could I presume to defy you? Or I could not obey because I did not, for instance, have your strength, your appetite, your skill, although you expected it of me as a matter of course. This was the greatest disgrace of all. This was not the course of the child's reflections, but of his feelings. My situation at that time becomes clearer, perhaps, if I compare it with that of Felix. You do, of course, treat him in a similar way, even indeed employing a particularly terrible method against him in his upbringing. Whenever at meals he does anything that is in your opinion unclean, you are not content to say to him, as you used to say to me, you are a pig, but add, a real Hermann, or, just like your father. Now this may perhaps one can't say more than, perhaps, not really harm Felix in any essential way, because you are only a grandfather to him. An especially important one, of course, but still not everything as you were for me. And besides, Felix is of a quiet, even at this stage to a certain extent manly character, one who may perhaps be disconcerted by a great voice thundering at him, but not permanently conditioned by it. But above all he is, of course, only comparatively seldom with you, and besides, he is also under other influences. You are for him a rather endearing curiosity from which he can pick and choose whatever he likes. For me you were nothing in the least like a curiosity. I couldn't pick and choose, I had to take everything. And this without being able to produce any arguments against any of it. For it is fundamentally impossible for you to talk calmly about a subject you don't approve of, or even one that was not suggested by you. Your imperious temperament does not permit it. In recent years you have been explaining this as due to your nervous heart condition. I don't know that you were ever essentially different. Rather, the nervous heart condition is a means by which you exert your domination more strongly, since the thought of it necessarily chokes off the least opposition from others. This is, of course, not a reproach, only a statement of fact. As in Atla's case, when you say, you simply can't talk to her at all, she flies straight in your face, but in reality she does not begin by flying out at all. You mistake the person for the thing. The thing under discussion is what flies in your face, and you immediately made up your mind about it without listening to the person. Whatever is brought forward afterward merely serves to irritate you further, never to convince you. Then all one gets from you is, do whatever you like. So far as I'm concerned you have a free hand. You're of age, I've no advice to give you, and all this with that frightful, hoarse undertone of anger and utter condemnation that makes me tremble less today than in my childhood, only because the child's exclusive sense of guilt has been partly replaced by insight into our helplessness, yours and mine. The impossibility of getting on calmly together had one more result, actually a very natural one: I lost the capacity to talk. I dare say I would not have become a very eloquent person in any case, but I would, after all, have acquired the usual fluency of human language. But at a very early stage you forbade me to speak. Your threat, not a word of contradiction, and the raised hand that accompanied it have been with me ever since. What I got from you, and you are, whenever it is a matter of your own affairs, an excellent talker, was a hesitant, stammering mode of speech, and even that was still too much for you. And finally I kept silent, at first perhaps out of defiance, and then because I could neither think nor speak in your presence. And because you were the person who really brought me up, this has had its repercussions throughout my life. It is altogether a remarkable mistake for you to believe I never complied with your wishes. Always contrary was really not my basic principle where you were concerned, as you believe and as you reproach me. On the contrary, if I had obeyed you less, I am sure you would have been much better pleased with me. As it is, all your educational measures hit the mark exactly. There was no hold I tried to escape. As I now am, I am the result of your upbringing and of my obedience. That this result is nevertheless distressing to you, indeed that you unconsciously refuse to acknowledge it as the result of your methods of upbringing, is due to the fact that your hand and the material I offered were so alien to each other. You would say, not a word of contradiction, thinking that that was a way of silencing the oppositional forces in me that were disagreeable to you, but the effect of it was too strong for me, I was too docile. I became completely dumb, cringed away from you, hid from you, and only dared to stir when I was so far away from you that your power could no longer reach me, at least not directly. But you were faced with all that, and it all seemed to you to be contrary, whereas it was only the inevitable consequence of your strength and my weakness. Your extremely effective rhetorical methods in bringing me up, which never failed to work with me, were abuse, threats, irony, spiteful laughter, and oddly enough self-pity. I cannot recall your ever having abused me directly and in downright abusive terms. Nor was that necessary, you had so many other methods, and besides, in talk at home and particularly at the shop the words of abuse went flying around me in such swarms, as they were flung at other people's heads. That as a little boy I was sometimes almost stunned and had no reason not to apply them to myself too. For the people you were abusing were certainly no worse than I was, and you were certainly not more displeased with them than with me. And here again was your enigmatic innocence and inviolability. You cursed and swore without the slightest scruple, yet you condemned cursing and swearing in other people and would not have it. You reinforced abusiveness with threats, and this applied to me too. How terrible for me was, for instance, that "I'll tear you apart like a fish," although I knew, of course, that nothing worse was to follow. But it was almost exactly in accord with my notions of your power, and I saw you as being capable of doing this too. It was also terrible when you ran around the table, shouting, grabbing at one, obviously not really trying to grab, yet pretending to, and mother had to rescue one, as it seemed. Once again one had, so it seemed to the child, remained alive through your mercy and bore one's life henceforth as an undeserved gift from you. This is also the place to mention the threats about the consequences of disobedience. When I began to do something you did not like and you threatened me with the prospect of failure, my veneration for your opinion was so great that the failure became inevitable. Even though perhaps it happened only at some later time. I lost confidence in my own actions. I was wavering, doubtful. The older I became, the more material there was for you to bring up against me as evidence of my worthlessness. Gradually you began really to be right in a certain respect. Once again, I am careful not to assert that I became like this solely through you. You only intensified what was already there, but you intensified it greatly, simply because where I was concerned you were very powerful and you employed all your power to that end. You put special trust in bringing up children by means of irony, and this was most in keeping with your superiority over me. An admonition from you generally took this form: can't you do it in such and such a way? That's too hard for you, I suppose. You haven't the time, of course, and so on. And each such question would be accompanied by malicious laughter and a malicious face. One was, so to speak, already punished before one even knew that one had done something bad. Maddening were also those rebukes in which one was treated as a third person, in other words, considered not worthy even to be spoken to angrily. That is to say, when you would speak ostensibly to mother but actually to me, who was sitting right there. For instance, of course, that's too much to expect of our worthy son, and the like. This produced a corollary in that, for instance, I did not dare to ask you, and later from habit did not even really much think of asking, anything directly when mother was there. It was much less dangerous for the child to put questions to mother, sitting there beside you, and to ask mother, "How is father?" So guarding oneself against surprises. There were, of course, also cases when one was entirely in agreement with even the worst irony, namely, when it referred to someone else. Such as Ellie, with whom I was on bad terms for years. There was an orgy of malice and spiteful delight for me when such things were said of her, as they were at almost every meal. She has to sit 10 feet back from the table, the big fat lump, and when you, morosely sitting on your chair without the slightest trace of pleasantness or good humor, a bitter enemy, would exaggeratedly imitate the way she sat, which you found utterly loathsome. How often such things happened, over and over again, and how little you really achieved as a result of them. I think the reason was that the expenditure of anger and malice seemed to be in no proper relation to the subject itself. One did not have the feeling that the anger was caused by this trifle of sitting some way back from the table, but that the whole bulk of it had already been present to begin with, then only by chance, happened to settle on this matter as a pretext for breaking out. Since one was convinced that a pretext would be found anyway, one did not try very hard, and one's feelings became dulled by these continued threats. One had gradually become pretty sure of not getting a beating, anyway. One became a glum, inattentive, disobedient child, always intent on escape, mainly within one's own self. So you suffered, and so we suffered. From your own point of view you were quite right when, clenching your teeth and with that gurgling laughter that gave the child its first notions of hell, you used to say bitterly, "A nice crowd that is." What seemed to be quite incompatible with this attitude toward your children was, and it happened very often, that you openly lamented your situation. I confess that as a child I was completely callous about this and could not understand how you could possibly expect to get any sympathy from anyone. You were such a giant in every respect. What could you care for our pity or even our help? Our help, indeed, you could not but despise, as you so often despised us ourselves. Hence, I did not take these laments at their face value and looked for some hidden motive behind them. Only later did I come to understand that you really suffered a great deal because of your children. But at that time, when these laments might under different circumstances still have met with a childish, candid sympathy, unhesitatingly ready to offer any help it could, to me they had to seem like over-emphatic means of disciplining me and humiliating me, as such not in themselves very intense, but with the harmful side effect that the child became conditioned not to take very seriously the very things it should have taken seriously. Fortunately, there were exceptions to all this, mostly when you suffered in silence, and affection and kindliness by their own strength overcame all obstacles, and moved me immediately. Rare as this was, it was wonderful. For instance, in earlier years, in hot summers, when you were tired after lunch, I saw you having a nap at the office, your elbow on the desk. Or you joined us in the country, in the summer holidays, on Sundays, worn out from work, or the time mother was gravely ill and you stood holding on to the bookcase, shaking with sobs. Or when, during my last illness, you came tiptoeing to Atla's room to see me, stopping in the doorway, craning your neck to see me, and out of consideration only waved to me with your hand. At such times one would lie back and weep for happiness, and one weeps again now, writing it down. You have a particularly beautiful, very rare way of quietly, contentedly, approvingly smiling, a way of smiling that can make the person for whom it is meant entirely happy. I can't recall its ever having expressly been my lot in my childhood, but I dare say it may have happened. For why should you have refused it to me at a time when I still seemed blameless to you and was your great hope? Yet in the long run even such friendly impressions brought about nothing but an increased sense of guilt, making the world still more incomprehensible to me. I would rather keep to the practical and permanent. In order to assert myself even a little in relation to you, and partly too from a kind of vengefulness, I soon began to observe little ridiculous things about you, to collect them and to exaggerate them. For instance, how easily you let yourself be dazzled by people who were only seemingly above you, how you would keep on talking about them as of some imperial counselor or some such. On the other hand, such things also pained me, to see you, my father, believing you had any need of such trifling confirmations of your own value, and boasting about them, or I would note your taste for indecent expressions, which you would produce in the loudest possible voice, laughing about them as though you had said something particularly good, while in point of fact it was only a banal little obscenity. There were, of course, plenty of such observations. I was happy about them, they gave me occasion for whispering and joking. You sometimes noticed it and were angry about it, took it for malice and lack of respect, but believe me, it was for me nothing other than a means moreover. A useless one of attempted self-preservation. They were jokes of the kind that are made about gods and kings, jokes that are not only compatible with the profoundest respect but are indeed part and parcel of it. Incidentally, you too, in keeping with your similar position where I was concerned, tried a similar form of self-defense. You were in the habit of pointing out how exaggeratedly well off I was and how well I had in fact been treated. That is correct, but I don't believe it was of any real use to me under the prevailing circumstances. It is true that Mother was endlessly good to me, but for me all that was in relation to you, that is to say, in no good relation. Mother unconsciously played the part of a beater during a hunt. Even if your method of upbringing might in some unlikely case have set me on my own feet by means of producing defiance, dislike, or even hate in me, Mother cancelled that out again by kindness. By talking sensibly, by pleading for me. And I was again driven back into your orbit, which I might perhaps otherwise have broken out of, to your advantage and to my own. Or it happened that no real reconciliation came about, that Mother merely shielded me from you in secret, secretly gave me something, or allowed me to do something. And then where you were concerned I was again the furtive creature, the cheat, the guilty one. Who in his worthlessness could only pursue sneaky methods even to get the things he regarded as his right. Of course, I became used to taking such a course also in quest of things to which, even in my own view, I had no right. This again meant an increase in the sense of guilt. It is also true that you hardly ever really gave me a beating. But the shouting, the way your face got red, the hasty undoing of the suspenders and laying them ready over the back of the chair, all that was almost worse for me. It is as if someone is going to be hanged. If he really is hanged, then he is dead and it is all over. But if he has to go through all the preliminaries to being hanged and he learns of his reprieve only when the noose is dangling before his face, he may suffer from it all his life. Besides, from the many occasions on which I had, according to your clearly expressed opinion, deserved a beating but was let off at the last moment by your grace, I again accumulated only a huge sense of guilt. On every side I was to blame, I was in your debt. You have always reproached me, either alone or in front of others, since you have no feeling for the humiliation of the latter. And your children's affairs were always public, for living in peace and quiet, warmth and abundance, lacking nothing, thanks to your hard work. I think of remarks that must positively have worn grooves in my brain, such as, when I was only 7 I had to push a handcart from village to village. We all had to sleep in one room. We were glad when we got potatoes. For years I had open sores on my legs because I did not have enough warm clothes. I was only a little boy when I was sent to Pisek to work in a store. I got nothing from home, not even when I was in the army. But still I managed to send money home. But for all that father was always father to me. Ah, nobody knows what that means these days. What do these children know? Nobody's been through that. Does any child understand such things today? Under other conditions such stories might have been very educational. They might have been a way in encouraging one and strengthening one to endure torments and deprivations similar to those one's father had undergone. But that wasn't what you wanted at all. The situation had, after all, become quite different as a result of all your efforts, and there was no opportunity to distinguish oneself as you had done. Such an opportunity would first of all have had to be created by violence and revolutions. It would have meant breaking away from home, assuming one had had the resolution and strength to do so, and that mother wouldn't have worked against it, for her part. With other means, but that was not what you wanted at all, that you termed ingratitude, extravagance, disobedience, treachery, madness. And so, while on the one hand you tempted me to it by means of example, story, and humiliation, on the other hand you forbade it with the utmost severity. Otherwise, for instance, you ought to have been delighted with Atla's Zuro escapade *, apart from the accompanying circumstances. She wanted to get back to the country from which you had come, she wanted work and hardship such as you had had, she did not want to depend on the fruits of your labor. Just as you yourself were independent of your father. Were those such dreadful intentions? Was that so remote from your example and your precept? Well, Atla's intentions finally came to nothing in practice, were indeed perhaps carried out in a somewhat ridiculous way, with too much fuss. And she did not have enough consideration for her parents. But was that exclusively her fault and not also the fault of the circumstances and, above all, of the fact that you were so estranged from her? Was she any less estranged from you in the business than afterward at Zurel? And would you not quite certainly have had the power to turn that escapade into something very good by means of encouragement, advice, and supervision, perhaps even merely by means of toleration? Asterisk refers to his sister Atla's taking over the management of a farm in the German Bohemian town of Zurel. Kafka spent time with her there during his illness in 1917–18. In connection with such experiences you used to say, in bitter jest, that we were too well off. But that joke is, in a sense, no joke at all. What you had to fight for we received from your hand, but the fight for external life, a fight that was instantly open to you and which we are, of course, not spared either. We now have to fight for only late in life, in our maturity but with only childish strength. I do not say that our situation is therefore inevitably less favorable than yours was, on the contrary. It is probably no better and no worse. Only we have the disadvantage of not being able to boast of our wretchedness and not being able to humiliate anyone with it as you have done with your wretchedness. Nor do I deny that it might have been possible for me to really enjoy the fruits of your great and successful work. That I could have turned them to good account and, to your joy, continued to work with them, but here again, our estrangement stood in the way. I could enjoy what you gave, but only in humiliation, weariness, weakness, and with a sense of guilt. That was why I could be grateful to you for everything only as a beggar is, and could never show it by doing the right things. The next external result of this whole method of upbringing was that I fled everything that even remotely reminded me of you. First, the business. In itself, especially in my childhood, so long as it was still a simple shop, I ought to have liked it very much, it was so full of life, lit up in the evening, there was so much to see and hear. One was able to help now and then, to distinguish oneself, and, above all, to admire you for your magnificent commercial talents, for the way you sold things, managed people, made jokes. Were untiring, in case of doubt knew how to make the right decision immediately, and so forth. Even the way you wrapped a parcel or opened a crate was a spectacle worth watching. All this was certainly not the worst school for a child. But since you gradually began to terrify me on all sides and the business and you became one thing for me, the business too made me feel uneasy. Things that had at first been a matter of course for me there now began to torment and shame me, particularly the way you treated the staff. I don't know, perhaps it was the same in most businesses, In the assicurazioni generali, for instance, in my time it was really similar, and the explanation I gave the director for my resignation was, though not strictly in accordance with the truth, still not entirely a lie, my not being able to bear the cursing and swearing, which incidentally had not actually been directed at me. It was something to which I had become too painfully sensitive from home, but in my childhood other businesses did not concern me. But you I heard and saw shouting, cursing, and raging in the shop, in a way that in my opinion at that time had no equal anywhere in the world. And not only cursing, but other sorts of tyrannizing. For instance, the way you pushed goods you did not want to have mixed up with others off the counter, only the thoughtlessness of your rage was some slight excuse, and how the clerk had to pick them up. Or your constant comment about a clerk who had TB. The sooner that sick dog croaks the better. You called the employees paid enemies, and that was what they were, but even before they became that, you seemed to me to be their paying enemy. There, too, I learned the great lesson that you could be unjust. In my own case I would not have noticed it so soon, for there was too much accumulated sense of guilt in me ready to admit that you were right. But in the shop, in my childish view, which later, of course, became somewhat modified, although not too much so, were strangers, who were after all working for us, and for that reason had to live in constant dread of you. Of course I exaggerated, because I simply assumed you had as terrible an effect on these people as on me. If it had been so, they could not have lived at all. Since, however, they were grown-up people, most of them with excellent nerves, they shook off this abuse without any trouble, and in the end it did you much more harm than it did them. But it made the business insufferable to me, reminding me far too much of my relations with you. Quite apart from your proprietary interest and apart from your mania for domination even as a businessman. You were so greatly superior to all those who ever came to learn the business from you that nothing they ever did could satisfy you, and you must, as I assumed, in the same way be forever dissatisfied with me too. That was why I could not help siding with the staff. I did it also, by the way, because from sheer nervousness I could not understand how anyone could be so abusive to a stranger. And therefore from sheer nervousness and for no other reason than my own security I tried to reconcile the staff, which must, I thought, be in a terrible state of indignation with you and with our family. To this end it was not enough for me to behave in an ordinary decent way toward the staff, or even modestly. More than that, I had to be humble, not only be first to say, good morning, or good evening, but if at all possible I had to forestall any return of the greeting. And even if I, insignificant creature that I was, down below, had licked their feet, it would still have been no compensation for the way that you, the master, were lashing out at them up above. This relationship that I came to have toward my fellow man extended beyond the limits of the business and on into the future, something similar, but not so dangerous and deep-going as in my case, is for instance Adla's taste for associating with poor people, sitting together with the maids, which annoys you so much, and the like. In the end I was almost afraid of the business, and, in any case, it had long ceased to be any concern of mine even before I went to the gymnasium, and hence was taken even further away from it. Besides, it seemed to be entirely beyond my resources and capacities since, as you said, it exhausted even yours. You then tried to extract, nevertheless, some little sweetness for yourself from my dislike of the business. Of your world-a dislike that was after all very distressing to you, by asserting that I had no business sense, that I had loftier ideas in my head, and the like. Mother was, of course, delighted with this explanation that you wrung from yourself, and I too, in my vanity and wretchedness, let myself be influenced by it. But if it had really been only or mainly loftier ideas that turned me against the business, they would have had to express themselves differently, instead of letting me float quickly and timidly through my schooling and my law studies until I finally landed at a clerk's desk. If I was to escape from you, I had to escape from the family as well, even from mother. True, one could always get protection from her, but only in relation to you. She loved you too much and was too devoted and loyal to you to have been for long an independent spiritual force in the child's struggle. This was, incidentally, a correct instinct of the child, for with the passing of the years mother became ever more closely allied to you. While, where she herself was concerned, she always kept her independence, within the narrowest limits, delicately and beautifully, and without ever essentially hurting you, still. With the passing of the years she more and more completely, emotionally rather than intellectually, blindly adopted your judgments and your condemnations with regard to the children. Particularly in the case certainly a grave one of Adla. Of course, it must always be borne in mind how tormenting and utterly wearing mother's position in the family was. She toiled in the business and in the house, and doubly suffered all the family illnesses, but the culmination of all this was what she suffered in her position between us and you. You were always affectionate and considerate toward her, but in this respect, you spared her just as little as we spared her. We all hammered ruthlessly away at her, you from your side, we from ours. It was a diversion, nobody meant any harm, thinking of the battle that you were waging with us and that we were waging with you, and it was mother who got the brunt of all our wild feelings. Nor was it at all a good contribution to the children's upbringing the way you, of course, without being in the slightest to blame for it yourself, tormented her on our account. It even seemed to justify our otherwise unjustifiable behavior toward her. How she suffered from us on your accounts and from you on our account, even without counting those cases in which you were in the right because she was spoiling us. Even though this spoiling may sometimes have been only a quiet, unconscious counter-demonstration against your system. Of course, mother could not have borne all this if she had not drawn the strength to bear it from her love for us all and her happiness in that love. My sisters were only partly on my side. The one who was happiest in her relation to you was Valley. Being closest to mother, she fell in with your wishes in a similar way, without much effort and without suffering much harm. And because she reminded you of mother, you did accept her in a more friendly spirit, although there was little Kafka material in her. But perhaps that was precisely what you wanted. Where there was nothing of the Kafkas, even you could not demand anything of the sort, nor did you feel, as with the rest of us, that something was getting lost which had to be saved by force. Incidentally, you may never have particularly loved the Kafka king, insofar as it expressed itself in women. Valley's relationship with you might even have become friendlier if the rest of us hadn't disturbed it a little. Ellie is the only example of one of us almost completely successfully breaking away from your circle. When she was a child I would have least expected it from her. She was such a ponderous, tired, timid, sullen, guilt-ridden, excessively humble, spiteful, lazy, gluttonous, stingy child that I could hardly bear to look at her, not even speak to her. She reminded me so much of myself, she was educated so much in the same way as I was. Her stinginess especially was abhorrent to me, as I probably had even more of it. Stinginess is one of the most reliable signs of profound unhappiness. I was so uncertain of everything that I effectively only possessed what I already had in my hands or in my mouth, or at least what was on its way there, and that was precisely what she, who was in a similar situation, preferred to take away from me. But all that changed when she left home at a young age, that's the most important thing, got married and had children. She became cheerful, carefree, courageous, generous, unselfish and full of hope. It's almost unbelievable how you didn't even notice that change and at least didn't judge it on its merits. You were so blinded by the grudge you'd always had against Ellie and basically still have. Although that grudge has become much less intense now that Ellie no longer lives with us and, moreover, your love for Felix and affection for Carl have made it less important. Only Gertie still has to pay for it sometimes. I hardly dare to write about Adla. I know that if I did I would jeopardize the whole hoped-for effect of this letter. Under normal circumstances, i.e. when she wasn't in any particular difficulty or danger, you just hate her. You yourself have admitted to me that in your opinion she constantly causes you suffering and makes you angry deliberately. And that when you're suffering because of her she's satisfied and rejoices. So she's a kind of devil for you. What a terrible estrangement, even greater than between you and me, must have occurred between you and her to have made such a tremendous misjudgment possible. She's so far from you now that you hardly see her any more, but instead there's a ghost where you suppose she is. I admit that you had a particularly hard time with her. I don't quite understand that very complicated situation, but in any case there was something of Loie there, equipped with the best Kafka weapons. There was no real fighting between you and I, as I was soon overcome. The result for me was flight, bitterness, grief and inner conflict. But you two were always fighting, always fresh, always strong. It was a spectacle as magnificent as it was bleak. Right at the beginning you were no doubt very close to each other, for even today, of the four of us, Adla is perhaps the purest manifestation of the marriage between you and Mother and of the forces that joined you together. I don't know what deprived you of the happiness of a harmonious relation between father and child. I can only believe that its development was similar to mine. On your side there was your tyrannical personality, on her side the Loie defiance, sensitivity, sense of justice and restlessness, all strengthened by consciousness of the Kafka power. I too have influenced her, but hardly of my own account, rather through the simple fact of my existence. Incidentally, she was the last one to enter into those already established power relationships and she was able to form her own judgment from all the available material. I can even imagine that she hesitated for a while as to whether she should throw herself on your breast or on your opponent's. You obviously at the time let the opportunity pass and you repulsed her, but if it had been possible you would have become a splendid, harmonious couple. I would have lost an ally, but the sight of the two of you would have compensated me richly. And you would have been transformed favorably in my eyes by the incalculable happiness of finding full satisfaction in at least one child. But all that's just a dream today. Adla has no contacts with her father now and has to seek her own way, just as I do, and because she has more assurance, self-confidence, good health and unscrupulousness than I do, she's more wicked and more treacherous than I am in your eyes. I understand that, from your point of view she can't be otherwise. Yes, she's able to look at herself with your eyes, to sympathize with your suffering and to be very sad about it, not to despair, despairing's my domain, but to be very sad about it. In apparent contradiction to that you often see us together, we're whispering and laughing and now and then you hear yourself mentioned. You have the impression that we're cheeky conspirators. Strange conspirators. You've always been a main topic of our conversations and our thoughts, but we really don't get together to think up something against you but rather do our best, in a spirit of gaiety, seriousness, love, defiance, anger, antipathy, surrender and guilt, with all the powers of our heads and hearts, we analyze together the terrible process that's hovering between you and us in all its details. From all sides, on all occasions, from far and near, in order to surmount it, this process in which you always claim to be the judge, while you, at least for the most part, are just as weak and blinded a party as we are. In that context, an instructive example of the effect of your way of bringing us up was Irma. On the one hand, she was a stranger who came into your business already grown up, for whom you were essentially her boss, and therefore she was only partly exposed to your influence and was at an already resistant age. On the other hand, however, she was also a blood relative who worshipped her father's brother in you, and you had much more than the mere power of a boss over her. And yet she, who in her weak body was so capable, clever, hard-working, modest, trustworthy, unselfish and faithful, who loved you as an uncle and admired you as a boss, who proved herself in other positions before and after, wasn't a very good employee for you. Of course, she was also urged on by us, and she was close to being a child for you. But the enveloping power of your personality had such a great effect on her that there developed in her, though only towards you and, hopefully, without deeper suffering on the part of the child, forgetfulness, carelessness, dark humor, and perhaps even some defiance insofar as she was capable of it at all. Whereby I don't even take into account that she was sickly, wasn't very happy in other respects either, and that a dreary domesticity weighed on her. You summed up what for me was the complex richness of your relationship with her in a sentence that has become classic for us, almost blasphemous. But that very much shows the off-handed innocence of your way of treating people. God in His grace has bestowed swine on me. I could describe further other spheres of your influence and the struggles of people against it, but there I would already enter into the uncertain and would have to divine. Besides, the further you distance yourself from business and family, the friendlier, more yielding, more polite, more considerate, more empathetic you always become, just as, for example, even an autocrat once he's outside the borders of his country has no reason to still be tyrannical and can good-naturedly get involved even with the lowest people. Indeed, in the group pictures from Franzensbad, for example, you always stood out so big and cheerful among the other morose little people, like a king on a journey. The children could certainly also have benefited from it, but they would have had to be able to recognize it in their childhood, which was impossible. And I, for example, would have had to not always live in the innermost, strictest, most constricting circle of your influence, as I really did. I thereby didn't just lose my sense of family, as you claimed. On the contrary, I still used to have a sense of family, although a mainly negative one as regards my detachment from you. My relationships with people outside the family, however, suffered even more if possible because of your influence. You're quite mistaken when you think that I do everything for other people out of love and loyalty, and nothing for you and the family because of my coldness and of betrayal. I repeat for the 10th time, I probably would have become a timid, anguished person in any case, but there's still a long, dark way to go from there to where I've in fact arrived. So far I've deliberately concealed relatively little in this letter, but now and later I'll have to conceal a few things that, between you and me, are still too hard for me to confess. I say this so that, if the overall picture becomes somewhat unclear here and there, you'll not think that a lack of evidence is to blame, but rather that there's more evidence that would make the picture unbearably crude. It's not easy to find a middle ground here. Here, moreover, it suffices to remind you of past events. I'd quite lost all self-confidence in face of you and had exchanged it for a boundless consciousness of guilt. I couldn't suddenly change when I came in contact with other people. On the contrary, I became even more deeply conscious of my guilt towards them, for as I've already said, I had to make amends to them for what you, under my joint responsibility in the business, had caused them. Furthermore, you had something to say against everyone with whom I had dealings, openly or secretly, and I had to apologize for that too. The mistrust that you tried to instill in me towards most people in business and in the family, name me one person who was important to me in some way during my childhood whom you didn't fundamentally criticize at least once, and which, strangely enough, didn't bother you in the slightest. You were quite strong enough to bear it. It was moreover perhaps really just a symbol of mastery for you, that mistrust, that as a child was nowhere confirmed for me in my own eyes as everywhere I saw only irreproachably excellent people, became in me a mistrust of myself and a perpetual fear of others. So in general I couldn't in any way escape from you in my relations with others. The fact that you were mistaken about that was perhaps because you didn't really know anything about my contacts with other people, and suspiciously and jealously assumed that I would have to compensate myself elsewhere for the loss of family life, since it would be impossible for me to live the same way elsewhere. Incidentally, in my childhood I still had a certain comfort in that respect, precisely because of my mistrust in my own judgment. I used to say to myself, "You're exaggerating, you're putting, as youth always does, too much importance on little exceptions." However, later I was practically deprived of that consolation as my understanding of the world developed. I didn't find my salvation from you in Judaism either. Salvation would have been conceivable there, but it would have been even more conceivable that we would have found each other in Judaism, or that we could even have come united out from the synagogue. But what kind of Judaism did I get from you? In the course of the years, I've come to see it in 3 different ways. As a child I reproached myself, as you did, for not going to the temple enough, for not fasting and so on. I didn't think I was doing wrong myself, but that I was doing wrong to you, and the consciousness of guilt, which was always there, penetrated me. Later as a youth I didn't understand how you, whose Judaism was so non-existent, could reproach me for not trying to maintain a similar empty Judaism. It was really nothing, as far as I could see. It was a joke, and not even a joke. You went to the temple 4 days in the year. You were at a minimum closer to those who were indifferent there than to those who took it seriously. You patiently did the prayers as a formality. You sometimes amazed me by being able to show me the passage in the prayer book that was being recited. Moreover, when I was in the temple I was allowed to roam around where I wanted. So I yawned and dozed through the many hours there and tried to enjoy as much as possible the few little diversions there were there. For example, when the Ark of the Covenant was opened, that always reminded me of the shooting galleries where a box door also opened when you hit a black one. Except that something interesting always came out there, and here it was always old dolls without heads. By the way, I was also very afraid there, not only, evidently, because of the many people with whom I came into close contact, but also because you once mentioned in passing that I too could be called to the Torah. That I trembled for years before that prospect. Otherwise, however, I wasn't ever really disturbed in my boredom, at the most by the bar mitzvah, which just required a ridiculous amount of memorization that only led up to a ridiculous performance at the examination, and then, insofar as you were concerned, by small, insignificant incidents. For example, when you were called to the Torah and survived that, to my mind, exclusively social event, or when you stayed at the memorial service in the temple and I was sent away. Which for a long time, obviously because of having been sent away and excluded from any deeper participation, gave me the barely conscious feeling that there was something indecent about it. That's what it was like for me in the temple. At home it was perhaps less interesting and was limited to the first Passover dinner, that became more and more a comedy with fits of laughter. Certainly under the influence of the bigger children. Why did you have to bow down to that influence? Because you provoked it. So that was the religious material that was handed down to me. To which was added at most the outstretched hand that pointed to the sons of the millionaire fox in the temple when we were there with your father on high holidays. I didn't understand how one could do anything better with this material than to get rid of it as quickly as possible, precisely that getting rid of it seemed to me to be the most pious way of acting. But later I looked at it differently and understood why you could believe that I was betraying you maliciously in that respect too. You really had brought some Judaism with you from your small ghetto-like village community. It wasn't much and you lost it a little in the city and in the military, but at least the impressions and memories of your youth were just enough for a Jewish life of sorts. Especially since you didn't need much help for that, as you came from a very strong stock and you could hardly be shaken by religious misgivings. As long as they weren't very much mixed up with social concerns. Basically, the faith that guided your life consisted in the fact that you believed in the unconditional correctness of the opinions of a certain Jewish social class, and thus, since those opinions were a part of your essential nature, you in fact believed in yourself. In that too there was still enough Judaism, but it was too little to be passed on to the child. It dried up completely while you passed it along. That was partly because your impressions of youth couldn't be handed down, and partly because of your fearsome character. It was also impossible to make a child who was so anxiously attentive understand that the few trifling exercises that you carried out in the name of Judaism, with an indifference quite corresponding to their nullity, could have a higher meaning. For you they had meaning as little souvenirs from earlier times, which is why you wanted to pass them on to me, but since they no longer had any inherent worth for you either, you could only do so either by persuasion or by threatening. On the one hand that couldn't succeed, and the other hand, since you didn't have the slightest idea of what a weak position you had, it necessarily made you very angry with me because of my apparent stubbornness. All that wasn't an isolated phenomenon, it was just like that with a large part of that Jewish transitional generation that had emigrated from the relatively still pious countryside to the cities. That was self-evident, but it added a quite painful element to our relationship that was already sharp enough. While you can certainly believe in your guiltlessness in that, just as I do, you should explain that guiltlessness by your character and by the circumstances of the time. And not just by external conditions, as you did by saying that you had too much work and worries to be able to bother with such things. Like that you turn your undoubted blamelessness into unjust reproaches against others. That's an attitude that's always very easy to refute, and is here too. It shouldn't have been a question of the kind of instruction that you should have given your children, but of an exemplary life. If your Judaism had been stronger, your example would also have been more compelling. That's of course again not an accusation at all, but just a defense against your reproaches. You recently read Franklin's memoirs of his youth. I really did give them to you to read on purpose, not, as you ironically remarked, because of a small passage about vegetarianism, but because of the relationship between the author and his father as it's described there, and the relationship between the author and his son, as is naturally recounted in those memoirs written for his son. I don't want to go into the details here. I also received a certain subsequent confirmation of this view of your Jewishness in your behavior in the last few years, when it seemed to you that I was becoming more concerned with Jewish things. Since you've had an aversion from the outset to all of my preoccupations and especially to the way I take an interest in things, you felt that way there too. But beyond that, one could have expected you to make a small exception in this case. After all, it was a Judaism that arose from your Judaism that was beginning there, and thus also the possibility of establishing new relations between us. I don't deny that if you'd shown interest in it, that could have made me suspicious. I wouldn't dream of claiming that I'm somehow better than you in that respect. But it never came to the test. Because of me, Judaism became abhorrent to you and Jewish writings became unreadable, they disgusted you. That could mean that you insisted that the kind of Judaism that you'd shown to me in my childhood was the only right one, that there was nothing beyond it. But that you should insist on that was hardly conceivable. But then the disgust could only mean that you unconsciously recognized the weakness of your Judaism and of my Jewish upbringing, that you didn't want to be reminded of it in any way, and that you responded to all reminders of it with open hatred. Incidentally, your negative esteem for my new Jewishness was very exaggerated. First of all, it incarnated your anathema for me, and secondly, fundamental relationships with fellow human beings was decisive for its development, and thus in my case fatal. You were more on the right path in your aversion for my writing and for what, unknown to you, was connected with it. There I had indeed become somewhat independent of you, even if it was a little like the worm that, trampled down by a foot at its back, then tears itself loose with the front part and drags itself aside. I was in security there to some extent. It gave me a breathing spell. The dislike you immediately had for my writing was, of course, welcome to me there for once. My vanity and ambition did suffer from your way of welcoming my books that's become well known. Put it on the bedside table, but basically I felt good, not just out of rebellious malice. Not just from joy at a new confirmation of my understanding of our relationship, but quite spontaneously because that formula sounded to me just like, "Now you're free." Of course I was deceiving myself. I wasn't free, or at best not yet. My writing was about you. I was just complaining there about what I couldn't complain about leaning on your chest. It was an intentionally protracted farewell to you, that while it was imposed on me by you nevertheless went in the direction that I had determined. But of what little importance all that was. It's only worth mentioning because it was a part of my life, elsewhere it wouldn't even have been worth noticing, and then only because it dominated my childhood as premonition. Later in life as hope, and often still later as despair, and dictated to me, taking your form again, if you like, my own few little decisions. For example, in my choice of profession. Certainly, you gave me complete freedom in that, in your generous and even patient way. However, with that you also were following the usual way of treating the sons of the Jewish middle class, or at least of applying the value judgments of that class that were decisive for you. In fact, one of your misunderstandings about me also played a part in this. You've always considered me to be particularly industrious out of paternal pride, out of ignorance of my real nature, and because of certain of your inferences about my poor health. As a child I was always in your opinion studying, and later always writing. That's not in the slightest way true. One could rather say with much less exaggeration that I studied little and learned nothing. That something has remained in the course of many years with an average memory and not the absolutely worst powers of comprehension isn't very strange, but in any case the total result in knowledge, and especially in the fundaments of knowledge, is extremely miserable in comparison with the expenditure of time and money in the middle of an outwardly carefree, calm life, especially in comparison with almost all of the people I know. It's pitiful but understandable to me. Ever since I can remember I've been so deeply concerned about affirming my spiritual existence that I've been indifferent to everything else. Our Jewish grammar school pupils are often quite peculiar. They are often the most improbable characters, but my cold, barely veiled, unshakable, childishly helpless, tending to the ridiculous, self-satisfied animalistic indifference of a self-sufficient but coldly quixotic child is something I've never found anywhere else. Although there it was also the only protection against a nervous breakdown because of fear and guilt. I was only absorbed by caring about myself, but in the most varied ways. For instance, worrying about my health. It began in a trivial way, now and then there was a little concern on account of digestion, of loss of hair, of a curvature of the spine and so on. That increased in innumerable gradations until finally it ended with a real illness. But as I wasn't sure of anything, as I needed at every moment a new confirmation of my existence. There was nothing that was really and undoubtedly in my sole possession and determined only by myself, as I was in truth a disinherited son. Naturally I began to doubt what was the closest thing to me, my own body. I grew in height but didn't know what to do with it, the burden was too heavy and my back became crooked. I hardly dared to move or even to do gymnastics, and I remained weak. I marveled at everything that I still disposed of, such as my good digestion, and that was enough to lose it, and that opened the way to all kinds of hypochondria. Until under the superhuman stress of wanting to get married blood started coming out of my lungs. For which a good part of the responsibility was no doubt the apartment in the Sconbourne Palace, that I only used because I thought I needed it for my writing, so that also belongs here. So all that didn't come from working too hard, as you've always imagined. There were years in which I spent more time loafing on the sofa in full health than you did in your whole life, all illnesses included. When I used to leave your presence appearing to be particularly busy, it was usually to go to lie down in my room. My total work output both in the office and at home has been minuscule. If you'd had an overview of it you'd have been horrified. I'm probably not really essentially lazy, but there was nothing for me to do. Where I lived I was rejected, condemned and beaten down, and to flee elsewhere was a great strain on me, but it wasn't work, because it was stress about something impossible that was beyond my powers. With a few small exceptions. So in that state I was given the freedom to choose a profession. But was I still at all capable of really using that freedom? Did I have enough confidence in myself to be able to acquire a real profession? My self-evaluation was much more dependent on you than on anything else, such as being outwardly successful, for example. Success was only a momentary comfort, nothing more, and on the other hand your weight always pulled me down much more. I thought I'd never get through the first grade of primary school, but I succeeded and even got a prize. Then I certainly wouldn't pass the grammar school entrance exam, but I succeeded. And then I'd definitely fail the first grammar school grade, but no, I didn't fail and I succeeded further and further. But that didn't give me any confidence, on the contrary, I was always convinced, and I saw proof of it in your dismissive expressions, that the more I succeeded, the worse it would turn out in the end. I often saw in my mind the terrible assembly of professors. The gymnasium is only the most coherent example. But everywhere around me it was similar, and how they would all get together if I survived the first grammar school grade, in the second grammar school grade if I survived that, in the third grammar school grade and so on, to investigate the unique case of how I, the most incompetent and in any case the most ignorant pupil, had succeeded in sneaking up to that grade and how. Once general attention was drawn to me, they would of course immediately throw me out to the rejoicing of all the righteous people who'd been freed from that nightmare. Living with such notions isn't easy for a child. Under those circumstances, what did I care about my lessons? Who was able to strike a spark of empathy out of me? I was interested in the lessons, and not only in the lessons, but in everything around me at that crucial age, about the same way as a bank defrauder who's still in position and is trembling from fear of discovery is interested in the small day-to-day banking business that he still has to do as a bank official. Everything was so small, so distant compared to what was important to me. Thus it carried on until the school leaving examination, that I really only got partly by a swindle, and then it was over, then I was free. If I'd only cared about myself in spite of the pressure of the gymnasium, what would it be like now that I was free? Thus I wasn't really free in my choice of profession. I knew that compared to what was essential for me, everything would be just as indifferent to me as all the subjects that I'd been taught at school. So it was a question of finding a profession that would best suit that indifference without hurting my vanity too much. So law was the obvious thing to do. Occasional vain little attempts to do something else, nonsensical aspirations such as studying chemistry for a fortnight and studying German for half a year, only strengthened that basic conviction. So I studied law. That meant that in a few months before the examinations I submitted myself to nervous exhaustion by literally feeding myself spiritually on sawdust that, moreover, had already been chewed over by thousands of mouths. But in a certain sense I enjoyed it, just as I'd enjoyed the grammar school and later the work in an office, because all that perfectly suited my situation. In any case, I showed astonishing foresight there. Even as a small child I had clear enough premonitions about my studies and profession. I didn't expect any salvation there, I already given up on that long ago. However, I had no foresight at all about the significance and possibility of marriage for me. That greatest horror of my life until then came upon me almost completely unexpectedly. The child had developed so slowly that such things were outwardly too remote for him. Now and then the need arose to think about it, but there was no recognition that there a lasting, decisive, and even extremely bitter test was looming. In reality, nevertheless, my attempts at marriage were extremely splendid, optimistic attempts at salvation, and the failures were correspondingly splendid. I'm afraid that because those attempts at marriage were all a failure for me, I therefore won't be able to make you understand them. And yet the success of this whole letter depends on it, because on the one hand all the positive forces that I disposed were concentrated in those attempts. And on the other hand all the negative forces that I've described as a result of your upbringing, i.e. my weaknesses, my lack of self-confidence and my guilt consciousness, were concentrated with fury there and literally drew a barrier between marriage and me. The explanation will also be difficult for me because I've thought and dug through everything here over and over again in so many days and nights now that thinking about it confuses me. The explanation will only be made easier in my opinion by your complete misunderstanding of the situation. And to improve such a complete misunderstanding a little doesn't seem to me to be excessively difficult. First of all, you see the failure of my effort to get married in the light of my previous failures. I would have nothing against that in itself, provided that you accepted my previous explanations of those failures. It belongs indeed in that sequence, but you underestimate the importance of that and underestimate it to such an extent that when we talk to each other about it we're actually talking about quite different things. I dare say that nothing has happened to you in your whole life that has had such significance for you as my attempts at marriage have had for me. By that I don't mean that you haven't experienced anything so significant in itself. On the contrary, your life has been much richer and more full of sorrows and more crowded than mine, but that's precisely why nothing like that has happened to you. It's as if one person has to climb 5 low steps and another only 1 step, which, at least for him, is as high as those 5 altogether. The first person will not only have mastered the 5 steps but hundreds and thousands more. He'll have led a full and very strenuous life, but none of the steps he's climbed will have had as much significance for him as that first high step for the other person. That he finds impossible to climb with all his strength, to which he can't attain and beyond which, of course, he cannot go. To get married, to found a family, to accept all the children that come along. To maintain them in this uncertain world and even to lead them a little is in my opinion the very utmost that a human being can succeed in. That so many seem to succeed so easily is no proof to the contrary, for in the first place not many really do succeed, and in the second place those not many usually don't do it. But rather it merely happens to them. That's not the utmost, but it's still really great and very honorable, especially since doing and happening can't be strictly separated from each other. And after all, it's not at all a question of achieving that utmost success, but just of a distant but proper approach to it. It's not after all necessary to fly into the middle of the sun, but it just suffices to crawl over to a nice little spot on earth where the sun sometimes shines and where one can warm oneself a little. How was I prepared for this one? As badly as possible. That's already evident from what's already been said. But as far as there's a direct preparation of the individual and a direct creation of the general basic conditions, you haven't intervened much externally. That couldn't have been otherwise. Here the general sexual mores specific to a nation and a period are decisive. Nevertheless you intervened there too, but not much, for the prerequisite for such an intervention can only be strong mutual trust, and we both lacked that for a long time at the decisive point. Rather unfortunately, because our needs were quite different. What concerns me scarcely touches you and vice versa. What's innocence with you can be guilt with me and vice versa. What remains inconsequential with you can be the lid of my coffin. I remember once I went for a walk with you and Mother in the evening. It was on the Josephsplatz near today's regional bank, and I began to talk about interesting things in a stupidly boastful, superior, proud, cool, cold and stuttering manner, as I usually did with you. And I reproached you for having left me so uninstructed in those matters that my classmates had to tell me about them first. And that I'd been in the vicinity of great dangers. There I was impudently lying, according to my nature, in order to show myself brave. Because due to my timidity I had no exact idea of the great dangers in question. But finally I hinted that fortunately I now knew everything and that I no longer needed advice and that everything was all right. In any case, I'd started talking about it mainly because I wanted to at least talk about it. Then also out of curiosity, and finally also in order to somehow take revenge on you for something or other. You took it very simply, as was your way, and you just said that you could give me advice on how I could do those things without any danger. Perhaps I'd wanted to elicit just such an answer that corresponded to the lustfulness of a child overfed with flesh and all good things, physically inactive and eternally preoccupied with himself. But nevertheless my outward shame was so hurt by it, or I believed it must be so hurt, that I just couldn't talk to you any longer about it and haughtily broke off the conversation. It's not easy to judge how you answered me then. On the one hand, there was something openly crushing about it, something primeval in a way, but on the other hand what you said was certainly very modern and unhesitating. I don't know how old I was at the time, certainly not much older than 16. For a boy like that it was, however, a very strange answer. And also the distance between the two of us was shown by the fact that it was actually the first direct lesson about life that I'd had from you. But its real meaning, that had already penetrated into me at that time but that I only became half aware of much later, was that what you advised me to do was, in your opinion, and even in mine at that time, the dirtiest thing of all. The fact that you wanted to make sure that I didn't physically bring any of the dirt home was secondary, because by doing so you were just protecting yourself and your home. The main thing was much more that you remained on the exterior of your advice. You were a husband, a pure man who was elevated above such things. That was probably aggravated for me at the time by the fact that I thought that marriage itself was shameless, and it was therefore impossible for me to apply what I had generally heard about marriage to my own parents. That made you even purer, that elevated you even higher. The idea that you could have given yourself similar advice before your own marriage was completely unthinkable to me. So there was almost no trace of earthly muck on you. And you pushed me down into that muck with a few straightforward words, as if it was my destiny. So if the world consisted only of me and you, an idea that was very close to me, then the purity of the world ended with you and the dirt began with me by virtue of your advice. In itself it was incomprehensible to me that you condemned me like that, only an ancient fault on my part and the deepest contempt on your part could explain it to me. And so I was once again affected, and certainly very deeply, in the most intimate, innermost center of my person. That's perhaps where the blamelessness of both of us becomes clearest. A gives me clear advice that corresponds to his view of life. It's not very nice, but it's something that's nevertheless quite common today, and it's advice that possibly prevents damage to one's health. The advice isn't very morally strengthening for B, but why shouldn't he be able to work his way out of the damage over time? Moreover, doesn't actually have to follow the advice at all, and in any case the advice on its own is no reason for B's whole future world to collapse. And yet something of the kind happens, but only because A is you and B is me. I can also perceive that mutual lack of guilt particularly well because a similar clash between us took place again some 20 years later under completely different circumstances. In fact, horrible circumstances, but in and of themselves certainly much more harmless, because in what way was there anything about me at 36 years old that could still be harmed? I'm referring to a little discussion we had on one of the agitated days after I'd announced my recent intention to get married. You said to me, she probably put on some kind of select blouse, as the Jewish women in Prague know how to do, and then of course you decided to marry her. And as quickly as possible, in a week, tomorrow, or today. I don't understand you. You're an adult, you live in the city and you don't know any other advice than to marry a random woman right away. Aren't there any other possibilities? If you're afraid of them, I'll go there with you myself. You spoke at greater length and more clearly, but I can't remember the details. Perhaps I became a little misty-eyed and was almost more interested by how Mother, who, although she completely agreed with you, just took something from the table and left the room. You've hardly ever humiliated me more deeply with words and never shown your contempt for me more clearly. When you'd spoken to me in a similar way 20 years ago, one could have even seen in it, from your point of view, even as a little respect for the precocious city boy who, in your opinion, could already be introduced into life that way without detours. Today that kind of respect could only increase your contempt for me, because the boy who got mired down in his attempt then doesn't seem to you richer now by any experiences but just 20 years more. Miserable. My choice of a young woman meant nothing to you. You'd always repressed my ability to make decisions, and now you believed that you knew what that ability was worth. You knew nothing of my attempts to save myself in other directions, therefore you also couldn't know anything of the train of thought that had led me to that marriage attempt. You had to try to divine them, and, in accordance with the overall judgment that you had of me, you divined in the most disgusting, ungraceful, ridiculous way. And you didn't hesitate for an instant to talk to me in the same way. The shame that you caused me was for you nothing compared to the disgrace you thought I'd do to your name by the marriage. Now it's easy for you to reply many things to me about my marriage attempts, and you've done so. That you couldn't have had much respect for my decision when I broke off the engagement with F twice and then took it up again twice. When I uselessly dragged you and Mother to the engagement ceremony in Berlin and the like. All that's true, but how did it come about? The basic idea of both marriage attempts was quite right, to start a household and to become independent. An idea that's sympathetic to you, except that in reality it turns out like in the child's game where one holds the other's hand and even squeezes it while shouting, "Oh, go Go on, why don't you go? In our case, however, it's complicated by the fact that you've always meant that go on, sincerely, since you've always held me, or more exactly held me in your power, without knowing it. Just by the very power of your personality. Both young women were chosen by chance, but extraordinarily well chosen. Another sign of your complete misunderstanding of me is that you can believe that I, such a timid, hesitant and suspicious fellow, could decide to marry on a whim, perhaps charmed by a blouse. Both marriages would have been marriages of convenience in a way, to the extent that it can be said that day and night, the first time for years, the second time for months. All my mental powers were concentrated on the project. Neither of the young women disappointed me, I just disappointed both of them. My judgment of them today is exactly the same today as when I wanted to marry them. It's also not the case that I disregarded the experience of my first marriage attempt and my second one, that I was reckless. The two cases were quite different, and it was precisely the earlier experience that gave me hope in the second case, that was much more promising. I don't want to talk about the details here. So why didn't I get married? There were particular obstacles, as there are everywhere, but life consists in taking on such obstacles. But the essential obstacle, unfortunately independent of the individual case, was that I'm obviously mentally incapable of getting married. That's shown by the fact that from the moment I decide to get married I can no longer sleep, my head burns day and night, there's no life left in me and I stagger around in despair. It's not really worries that cause that, although it's true that countless worries are entailed by my heavy-handedness and my pedantry, but they aren't the decisive factor. They finish the work on the corpse like worms do, but I'm decisively affected by something else. It's the general pressure exerted on me by my anguish, by my weakness and by my self-contempt. I shall try to explain it in more detail. In my attempts to get married, two seemingly contradictory things come together in my relationship with you more strongly than anywhere else. Marriage is certainly the guarantee of the greatest self-liberation and independence. I would have a family, the greatest thing that one can achieve in my opinion, and thus also the greatest thing that you've achieved. I would be your equal, all the old and eternally renewed shame and tyranny would merely be past history. That would be like a fairy tale, but that's what's so questionable about it. It's too much, that much just can't be achieved. It's as if someone were in prison and he not only intended to escape, which might be achievable, but he also and at the same time intended to convert the prison into a pleasure palace for himself. But if he escapes he can't rebuild, and if he rebuilds he can't escape. If I want to become independent in the special unhappy relationship that I have with you, I have to do something that has as little relationship to you as possible. Marriage is certainly the greatest thing and confers the most honorable independence. But it also at the same time stands in the closest relationship to you. There's something mad about wanting to escape from that dilemma, and my tentatives have almost always been punished by it. It's precisely that close relationship that, in part, makes me want to get married. I think that the equality that would then develop between us and that you could understand like no one else is so beautiful precisely because I could then be a free, grateful, blameless and upright son, and you could be a relaxed, non-tyrannical, compassionate and contented father. But for that everything that's happened would have to be undone, that is, we ourselves would have to be obliterated. But as we are, marriage is excluded for me precisely because it's your territory. Sometimes I imagine the map of the earth stretched out and that you're stretched out across it. And then it seems to me as if the only areas that come into consideration for my life are those which you either don't cover or which don't lie within your reach. And according to the idea I have of your greatness, there aren't many of those areas and they're not very comforting ones, and marriage in particular isn't one of them. That comparison alone proves that I don't mean to say that you've driven me away from marriage, as you did from business, by your example. It's the contrary, despite all of the distant similarities. In your marriage I saw someone who was exemplary in many respects. Exemplary in faithfulness, in mutual assistance, in number of children, and even when the children grew up and disturbed domestic peacefulness more and more, the marriage as such remained unaffected. Perhaps my high concept of marriage was formed precisely by that example. The fact that my desire for marriage was ineffectual had other reasons. They lay in your relationship with your children, which is what this whole letter is about. There's a school of thought according to which the fear of marriage sometimes derives from the fear that children will later pay you back for all the wrongs that you have committed against your own parents. I don't think that that has much importance in my case because my consciousness of guilt actually comes from you and so is too permeated throughout by its uniqueness. Indeed, that sense of its uniqueness is part of its tormenting essence. Going through all that again is inconceivable. Nevertheless, I must say that having such a silent, dull, dry, decayed son would be unbearable to me. If there were no other possibility, I'd probably flee from him. I'd emigrate as you first wanted to do because of my marriage. That might also play a role in my inability to marry. But much more important than that is my anxiety for myself. That has to be understood as follows. I've already indicated that I've made little attempts at independence with my literary activity and in everything connected with it. Little attempts to escape that have met with the smallest success. They'll hardly lead any further. Much has confirmed that to me. Nevertheless, it's my duty, or rather my life consists of watching over them, of defending them from any danger that I'm able to ward off. Indeed, to not let any possibility of such dangers menace them. Marriage is the possibility of such a danger, admittedly the possibility of the greatest encouragement, but it's enough for me that it's the possibility of a danger. What would I do then if it really was a danger after all? How could I continue to live in marriage with the perhaps unprovable, but in any case irrefutable sense of that danger? I might waver in the face of it, but the final outcome is certain. I'd have to give it up. The comparison of the sparrow in the hand and the dove on the roof is only remotely apt here. I have nothing in my hand, everything's on the roof, and yet, as determined by the conditions of my struggle and the necessities of my life, I have to choose nothingness. I had to make a similar choice when I chose my profession. The most important obstacle to marriage, however, is my already ineradicable conviction that everything that I've recognized in you is necessary for the preservation of the family and certainly for its leadership, and indeed everything altogether. The good and the bad, as they're organically united in you, namely, strength and mockery of others, good health and a certain excessiveness, the gift of speech and inadequacies, self-confidence and dissatisfaction with everyone else, worldly superiority and tyranny. Knowledge of human nature and distrust of almost everyone, and also virtues without any disadvantages such as industriousness, perseverance, presence of mind and intrepidity. In comparison, I had almost nothing or very little of all that, yet he still dared to want to get married while I saw that even you had to struggle hard in your marriage and had even failed towards your children. Of course I didn't ask myself that question expressly and I didn't answer it expressly. Otherwise ordinary thinking would have taken hold of the matter and shown me other men who are different from you, to name one very different from you. Uncle Richard, who got married and at least didn't break down under the strain, which is already a lot and would have been enough for me. But I didn't ask that question, I lived with it from my childhood onwards. I didn't wait for marriage to put myself to the test, I put myself to the test about any sort of little thing whatever. You'd convinced me of my inability to cope with every little thing, by your example and by your upbringing. As I've tried to describe it, and what was true in every little thing and that had proved you right had of course to be enormously true about the biggest thing, that is, about marriage. Until my tentatives to get married I grew up somewhat like a businessman who gets through the day without proper accounting, albeit with his worries and his worrisome forebodings. He makes a few small profits that he always fondles and exaggerates in his imagination because of their rarity, and otherwise he just has daily losses. Everything's entered into the accounts, but they never balance. Then there's a compulsion to draw up a balance sheet, that's to say, the attempt to get married. And it's as if, with the great sums that have to be reckoned with there'd never been even the smallest profit, just one great debt. And then to get married without going mad. That's how my life has been with you so far, and those are the prospects that it implies for the future. If you cared to examine my explanations of my fear of you, you could reply to me. You claim that I make it easy for myself when I explain my relationship with you simply by your faults, but I believe that in spite of seeming to make an effort. You don't make it more difficult for yourself in any way, but much more rewarding for yourself. At first you reject any guilt and responsibility on your part, so in that we proceed in the same way. But while I then, expressing myself as openly in words as in my thoughts, attribute the sole guilt to you. You want to be overly clever and overly tender at the same time and thereby absolve me of any guilt. Of course, you only seem to succeed in the latter, and it emerges between the lines, despite all your declarations about existence and nature and opposites and helplessness. That I was really the aggressor while everything you did was only in self-defense. So now you've already achieved enough through your insincerity, for you've proven three things. Firstly, that you're innocent. Secondly, that I'm guilty, and thirdly, that you're prepared out of sheer magnanimity not only to forgive me but, what's at the same time more and also less, also to prove and to want to believe it. Yourself that I, contrary to the truth moreover, am also innocent. That could be enough for you, but it's not yet enough for you. You've taken it into your head to want to live entirely at my expense. I admit that we fight with each other, but there are two kinds of combats. The chivalrous combat, where the forces of independent opponents measure themselves against each other, where each one remains steadfast for himself and loses for himself or wins for himself. And there's the battle of vermin, who not only sting but also suck blood to sustain themselves. That second kind is the real professional soldier, and that's you. You're unfit for life, but in order to make yourself comfortable, to be carefree and without self-reproach, you show that I've taken all your fitness for life from you and put it in my pocket. What do you care now if you're unfit to live, for it's my fault? But you stretch calmly out and let me drag you physically and mentally through life. An example, when you recently wanted to get married, at the same time, as you've admitted to me in this letter. You didn't want to get marred but wanted me to help you not to marry, so as not to have to make the effort yourself, by forbidding you to marry because of the disgrace the union would bring to my name. But that didn't occur to me at all. Firstly, I never wanted to hinder your happiness there or ever elsewhere else, and secondly, I never want to hear such an accusation from my own child. But did overcoming my reserves to be able to give you the option of marriage help in any way? Not at all. Refusal on my part to approve your marriage wouldn't have prevented it. On the contrary, it would have been even more of an incentive for you to marry the girl, because the attempt to escape, as you put it, would have become complete. And my permission to marry didn't prevent your reproaches, for you still maintain that I'm in any case to blame for your not marrying. But basically you've proved nothing else for me than that in that and in everything else all my reproaches were justified, and that among them one particularly justified reproach was missing. Namely of your being insincere, of pandering and of being a parasite. If I'm not very much mistaken, you're also parasiticing on me with this letter in itself. To that I reply that first of all that whole reproach, that can also be partly turned against you, doesn't come from you but from me. Your mistrust of others isn't as great as my mistrust of myself that you've brought me up to have. I don't deny a certain justification for that reproach, which in itself contributes new elements to the characterization of our relationship. Of course in reality things can't fit together like the proofs in my letter, life is more than a simple game of patience. But with the correction that results from this objection, a correction that I neither can nor want to elaborate on in detail. In my opinion something so close to the truth has been achieved that it can calm us both a little and make both living and dying a little easier. Franz